What's up, ladies and gentlemen? It's your boy, current UFC record holder for fewest knockdowns scored in the octagon, tied with Valentina Shevchenko and everyone else who's never fought in the UFC. Your boy, Jack Slack, and it's the Fights Gone By podcast episode 97, coming at you on the 6th of September. We're a few days out from UFC 228, so that's what we'll be talking about mostly today, which is a strange card. I'm looking at it and going, it's good, but will it get them off their tractors? We'll do a couple of questions later in the podcast, and we've got a little bit of news. Not an awful lot of news, but we've got some news. We'll start with the greatest piece of news that I've read all week, because it's so on brand for just how useless the UFC are at making stars. Nico Montano, who you may or may not know is the UFC women's flyweight champion at the moment, It was working on, some journalist was working on a piece with her, and he basically tweeted out that she had alleged that the UFC asked her to dress in war paint and buckskins for press events. If you don't know, I believe she's of Native American heritage, might have been Native Canadian heritage. Oh, well, I suppose it's all Native American technically, because it was, it's a continent. But, she's of that heritage, and, it's one thing for yourself to be like, yeah, this is my past, or this is my ancestry, and I do this because of that. Like Tito Ortiz carrying his two flags or whatever. I think it's another when the company's like, please do this. But then, they did the same thing with Kane. They were like, Kane, we're doing an event down in Mexico. Please get down there and be as Mexican as possible. And then Fabricio Verdum, who is like an actual linguistic polymath, is down there speaking Spanish. He also speaks like Russian and 5 other languages too, because of all the places he's taught. And Kane can't speak any. But yeah, I mean, people are offended by this, but really it's just them begging her to be more interesting. Or at least trying to create a way for her to be more interesting. I watched her fights this week, and I'm even less excited for that fight than I ever was. I did put some money on her. I parlayed it with Andrade winning. You can get a couple of quid if that happens. Well, obviously, because Montano is such a huge underdog. But we'll talk about that later. It's just the idea of asking someone to... Oh, God. That's like asking Tyron Woodley to... I don't know, I was about to say, like, bring a bucket of KFC to the post-fight thing, but firstly, that's more of a negative stereotype than, I suppose it's like asking him to wear, like, a Johnny Cochran kente tie, or something similar to that. It's just so bad. Oh, and why would you not assume that she'd immediately tell everyone and be offended? She's not been, like, the happiest, nicest... fighter that they've had to work with. She is placeholder because they want Valentina to win that title. Valentina currently ranked number 1 in the world at flyweight on Tapology. Montano at number 2. Who has Valentina Shevchenko beaten at 125 pounds? Some poor former junkie with no good wins from the Amazon somewhere, and that's it. But we'll talk more about that later. We're going to be despairing about that fight plenty, I'm sure. Gleison Tebow didn't spend long in the free agency pool. He was immediately snapped up by that young upstart of a promotion, in MMA at least, Golden Boy Promotions, and he's going to be on the undercard of Ortiz versus Liddell 3. I doubt he's on the undercard. I suspect he's probably on the main card, the undercard being like, the 3 fights leading up to Ortiz Liddell 3. The other great piece of entertainment that came out this week regarding Ortiz Liddell 3 was an infographic put up by ESPN, which showed Tito Ortiz as having a record of 19-2. He's actually like 19-12 or something. He has lost a lot of fights. There was a period when, aside from the Ryan Bader fight, he hadn't won in something like 5 years. And he hadn't won against anyone not named Ken Shamrock in like over 10. So... Yeah, I mean, you really have to try hard to sell people on this being anything except, Tito Ortiz from the past. You remember the past? You liked the past. It was warm and fuzzy back then. But really, isn't that just selling anything nowadays? But then I just did it too. I remember the past when we didn't sell things on nostalgia, but we totally actually did. Anyway, Jack Hermansson versus Gerald Meerschaert has been signed for UFC on Fox 31. Always nice to hear about some Jack Hermansson news, especially how good he was looking in his last fight. And Bobby Green versus Drakkar Klose. That's a really good fight. Two guys who've had good fights with Lando Venata, but then who hasn't had a good fight with Lando Venata? Still a little bit bitter about Drakkar Klose for that fight against David Tamer, where he managed to get Herb Dean to warn Tamer for inactivity because he was backing up and countering Klose the entire time. But he did look good against Lando Venata. He was using the overhook, pounding him with knees. Really nice. Ironically, something that David Tamer was doing against Lando Venata very well in their fight. Anyway, Rizin gets a 2-hour slot on Fuji TV. Now, I know fuck all about Japanese TV channels because even when I was living there for a little while, I had no idea what was going on. You just turn on any channel and almost certainly there is a panel full of people looking at some shit and going, oh, it's such a weird culture. I remember watching, they were smelling a whole heap of shoes and guessing who the shoes belonged to. It's a very strange TV system. But you'll remember that being on Japanese TV is huge. Numbers are way bigger over there than a lot of the world, especially on like New Year's Eve. It's the big thing. You stay in and watch TV with a KFC, funnily enough, and that was how Pride and K1 used to get amazing viewing figures on New Year's Eve. But Rizin getting a 2-hour TV slot on Fuji TV. Fuji TV is a big channel, and also I think Rizin's previous TV spots have been like mainly highlights and so on. This time they are going to be televising 2 live fights, which is great. We didn't actually talk about Tenshin versus Kyoji getting signed, which we'll talk about later because I have a question about that. But if they put that on TV, that's going to go down well, and that will actually give Tenshin that exposure that they've been claiming they can give him. Well, presumably that's why he's been with them, even though they're not giving him proper kickboxing matches and he's not doing MMA. So that might actually meet somewhere in the middle and give him something to gain out of being with them, aside from money. A piece of news from a couple of weeks ago, I think a week ago, that I missed, but it came to my attention this week and I thought I'd share it with you guys. Vitaly Minakov has apparently worked out his beef with the Bellator contract that he's under, and he's going to be heading back there this year, which is great news because he was their heavyweight champion for a little while. A considerably more interesting prospect than any of the heavyweights in the heavyweight tournament. Not including people like Ryan Bader, who aren't actually heavyweights, but, I'd still pick him over Bader, to be honest. But again, can't say that stuff about Michael Page and then not say it about Vitaly Minakov. He has not fought very many good fighters. I think he fought Czech Congo back in the day, but he did fight, the most recent is Bigfoot Silva, who was royally crocked by the time that Vitaly Minakov fought him. So we are waiting on Minakov. Basically, that's why I've wanted him to come back to Bellator and to work it all out, because he has potential, but we don't know how much. We don't know how good he is because he's not fought anyone decent. Oh, and a final fight announcement, Claudia Gadelha versus Nina Ansaroff announced. Nina Ansaroff, obviously Amanda Nunes' partner, but also just beat Angela Hill. She's doing pretty well, actually. I think she's on a streak of 3 wins. Claudia Gadelha, that lass who's always at the top of the strawweight division, but gasses all the time, and has never got through a second round without gassing. There we go, quick news wrap-up, and let's talk about UFC 228. Now, I was saying I think this is a weird card, because, it's $65. Whenever I say this, people go, oh, I didn't know you paid for pay-per-views in the UK. I don't, but, the business is built around pay-per-view. You can't dispute that. When we're talking about the business of fighting, everything they do is aimed at pay-per-views. It's why they won't ever hold a major event outside of the US or, somewhere on a US time zone. The last time they did anything close was when Bisping fought Dan Henderson. That's because they thought they'd get more from the tickets than they would from the actual event. And even then, they delayed it until 5 a.m., the main event, so that they could televise it at pay-per-view time in America. So if your whole thing when people complain about pay-per-view prices and not being worth the price of admission, or not price of admission, price of viewing, is to say, hey, you don't come from somewhere where you pay for it, you are missing the point and you're being a bell end. The future of the business, I think at some point they're going to have to move away from this model, but at present it's not looking that way. But maybe this will be the one that does it. I can't see this doing under 200,000. That seems to be like the base, the hardcore base. Mainly people who write about MMA buying the pay-per-view, but under 200,000 is really bad. And they've had a couple. Did they do it? Yeah, they did it this year. Who was it with? I think it was a Nunes fight. Can't remember. See, this one has a huge amount of appeal in terms of pure skill between Till and Woodley, but you've got to remember that Till's last fight was a snoozer, and Woodley's last two fights have been snoozers, and a lot of his fights before that were snoozers, and he is pretty much just the least, people complain about GSP, but at least he was always doing something. There are whole stretches of Woodley fights where he's just sort of standing on the cage doing nothing. So I can't see how many people you get motivated by this event when you've got such a weird card. Zabit's in, third place just before the co-main event, and he's fighting someone that most people have never heard of, Brandon Davis. There was the Yair fight there originally, and Yair pulled out, but that's still, looking at it, not strong. Anyway, let's go from bottom to top. Frank Camacho, love that guy. Also a pro golfer, isn't he? Against Jeffrey Neal. Frank Camacho had that incredible fight against Drew Dober. I really like what both were doing in that fight. He lost that fight to Dober, but I do remember thinking this guy's got some decent counters. He's setting some stuff up cleverly. Lost to Li Jiangliang, the Leech, back in 2017. Currently at 1-2 in the UFC. Meanwhile, Jeffrey Neal, of course, won his debut in the UFC against Brian Camozzi by rear naked choke. 9-2 Meech, 21-6. Yeah, that's a good fight. That's a pretty good one to open the prelims. Jared Brooks versus Roberto Sanchez. Fair enough. Irene Aldana versus Lucy Pudliova. I always find that there's just these people in the middle of the women's divisions that I just have watched but don't remember any of their fights. Jim Miller's back. Jim Miller versus Alex White. Now, Jim Miller, I have said for quite a while, has been royally crocked. But, Dustin Poirier's back in the mix, and it's only last year he lost that incredibly competitive decision to him. I thought it was a split. It's actually a majority, but good competitive fight. However, he's on a streak of 4 losses if you include that. Well, we do include that Poirier one because it was a loss. He did beat Thiago Alves back in 2016. I completely forgot that fight happened. But he got roughed up pretty bad by Pettis. Fought Ronaldo in, I can't remember much of that fight. And then, of course, Dan Hooker just worked him over. Oh my God, I forgot to mention even in the news that Dan Hooker versus Barbosa was just announced, I believe this morning, which we'd been talking about for a while, but I think that's a really fun fight. Difficult for Dan Hooker, because of what Dan Hooker's done in his recent fights, in his best performances, has been slowing the fight down, drawing out these very explosive, flashy strikers, where that's really more sort of the fight pace that Edson Barbosa wants. What Edson Barbosa has struggled with so much has been people just jamming their game down his throat, pushing him back to the fence, making him work overtime and never letting him get his feet set. So Dan Hooker has asked for a tough match up there. But anyway, we're talking about a far less interesting fight. We're talking about Alex White versus Jim Miller. White's coming off a loss to James Krause by decision back in January, but he did beat Mitch Clark before that. Yeah, I mean, White's sort of a mid-pack guy. Jim Miller's a former top-end guy who's been on his way down for a while. Fair enough. It's not as sad as seeing Diego Sanchez, who's next on the bill, fighting Craig the Thundercat White. And the reason he's fighting Craig White is because Craig White is the guy who came in against Neil Magny and was promptly knocked out with a knee a couple of months ago. You remember when everyone was like, oh wow, Neil Magny just stopped a guy with one knee. I guess there are levels to this shit. That's the guy. So that's why he's fighting Diego Sanchez. He probably shouldn't still be in the UFC, but he is. I mean, he's got a decent record in Cage Warriors, so and Neil Magny's a top end guy, so there's no real shame there. But maybe I'm being unfair to Craig White. I think a step back is what he needs. Lower end competition in the UFC, and if there's one thing that describes Diego Sanchez, it's that. Actually, no, the one thing I'd use to describe Diego Sanchez's sad state of affairs. Diego has 2 wins fairly recently. He beat Jim Miller, fuck me, and Marcin Held, which is a really strange one because Marcin Held was actually pretty respected. But Ross Pearson he didn't beat, Takanori Gomi he didn't beat, but he got those decisions. Martin Kempman he didn't beat, but he got that decision. So really going back to like Paulo Thiago for his last decisive win against anyone sort of. Well, we did say Marcin Held's good, but in between then, he's just been losing constantly. He had that competitive fight with Gilbert Melendez, but that was mainly because Gilbert Melendez was a lot worse than, harsh, but a lot worse than people thought he was. And, Gilbert Melendez's primary sin, and I was talking, who was I telling this? Oh, I was telling Bendo this when he was about to fight him. Gilbert Melendez throws his right hand and then stands still and slowly draws it back. He never throws more than like 2 punches in a row, and when he does, it's like 1-2, reload, and then 1-2 again, and he just stood in the pocket and got clipped by Diego. Diego for years has just been swinging from his knees, basically, and someone stood there long enough to get caught by it. But Miles Jury, Ricardo Lamas, Joe Lozen, ally akin to Matt Brown, these guys just mauled him, basically. Diego, he is crocked, and he's in love with his hands, and they've never been that good. And his striking's never been that good. What was really good about Diego Sanchez was his incredible pace and grappling. And if you watch the fight with Nick Diaz back in the day, I mean, Nick Diaz was still very good on the ground then, but that's like prime Diego Sanchez, and that is very impressive. But Diego Sanchez has come out this week and said that he's destined to be a world champion. Very sad stuff. Even weirder, I didn't put it in the news because it doesn't really fit in, I suppose, because it's more gossip. But apparently, Jackson Wink, the team, is just falling apart. Greg Jackson's there less and less. Wink, who I interviewed him back in the day. He's a cool guy. Has apparently sort of changed all the running of it, and now guys can just visitors can come in and spar with seasoned pros, like the best fighters in the world, or some of in terms of them being in the UFC. And Donald Cerrone was talking about this on the Joe Rogan Experience, and that just sounds the whole thing sounds super weird. You could understand that he's maybe hyperbolizing a little bit, exaggerating it, but there have been other guys who've been like, yep, that's a bit weird. Like Lando Venata came out and was like, yep, that's what's happening, and he tagged his location as Greg Jackson's MMA rather than Jackson Wink MMA. But I do think they have about 4 gyms, don't they, in the Albuquerque area, because one of my editors used to go to one of them that wasn't for the pros, but was for normal people. But at any rate, Donald Cerrone said that, and then Diego Sanchez came out and was like, I'll fight Donald Cerrone, this is the greatest gym on earth, blah, blah, blah. And you realise that Diego's not making a good case for that gym, because that gym's whole thing has been people going, firstly, massive drop-off after USADA. Could be coincidence, because their main thing is letting dudes fight forever. They've got this stable of dudes who in 2007, we were going, oh my god, greatest team on earth, full of killers. But a lot of their roster now is exactly the same as it was then. They don't have too many young guys appearing at the top end of cards or fighting their way up to the top end of cards, and they've got all these old names who the UFC still relies on for name value, but who just can't win as many fights. Diego being the first among them, and Diego at this point should be coaching. He should just. His whole thing was Donald Cerrone called it a puppy mill, and Diego was like, well, you should be around to train some of these young pups. And that's what Diego should be doing now. He should just be training people. But instead, he's out getting almost killed. And it's pretty bad that the team lets him. At a certain point, if you have that many great fighters coming in and out of your place, you should be able to say, no, we won't train you for this fight. If you want to do it somewhere else, But then part of that team and part of just running a team generally seems to be pretending that the damage doesn't exist. Everyone in the game thinks that they have a respect and understanding for the damage they are doing to themselves as they get hit and grind themselves down in training and in fights. But I don't think they do. I think a lot of people just ignore it and claim that they totally understand it and the risks and so on. Anyway, we're getting sad now. Sorry, we're talking about Diego Sanchez. He's fighting Craig White. I expect that Craig White smokes him, to be honest. I've not even seen much of Craig White fighting apart from being kneed in the head by Neil Magny. But I don't know, maybe Diego turns back the clock and runs a grappling clinic on him. But honestly, at this point with Diego Sanchez, it's if he wins, that's a bad thing, because he'll just keep going. Anyway, Darren Stewart versus Charles Byrd, fair enough. Jimmy Rivera versus John Dodson, that's a good fight hidden there in the middle of the card. On the prelims, in fact. Yeah, you got 2 very, very good bantamweights. Jimmy Rivera was in a title eliminator just the other day and got caught with a head kick straight off the bat. We don't know how he does against Marlon Moraes over rounds. But now he's back on the prelims and he's fighting John Dodson. And John Dodson obviously re-upped his contract recently. We did want to see him go and fight Kyoji, but he didn't. He wanted the UFC wanted him around, to be honest, but he won that split decision over Pedro Munoz a little while ago. Pedro Munoz, the slowest bantamweight on earth, just kept doing the same thing. Run to the right, double the left hand. And that's the other thing people complain about Jackson Wink. They just do the same things over and over again, and all their fighters seem to be like taught the same way. The Holly Holm combo, which is also the Carlos Condit combo, and so on. But yeah, I'll be interested to see how Jimmy Rivera deals with that, because he's a smart guy. He's a savvy striker who makes like middle adaptations, whereas John Dodson is a guy who sort of goes to the same things over and over again. But then John Dodson does have power. He just hasn't been able to land it in a while. He's been focusing on this like running style. And Jimmy Rivera does get cracked quite a lot. Jimmy Rivera is built like a dwarf from a Tolkien-esque video game. He's a square dude. It's strange. Aljamain Sterling and Cody Stamann, that's a good fight. I like Cody Stamann a lot. Who was I watching him for? Was it Mr. Misha Tate? What was his name? Brian Carrier. Oh, that was his last fight. That was back in March. God, that feels like it was ages ago. But he won a split decision in that fight. It was a really good fight. Caraway's grappling when they hit the mat was tremendous. Stamann was doing lovely stuff on the feet, and he was stopping the shots well until he finally couldn't. And once they hit the mat, he looked a little bit out of sorts, because Brian Caraway is a very, very good grappler, especially in MMA, and a very good guard passer in MMA. There's not an awful lot of them around. But Stamann also beat Tom Duquesnoy. Pat Wyman's boy. Tom Duquesnoy. To be fair, all the analysts were like, "Oh my god, Tom Duquesnoy. He's a good fighter, actually." But the Tyrion Ware fight is the one that I'm. Oh god, that's his most recent fight. Where the hell is Tom Duquesnoy, or Duquesnoy, if you will? But Aljamain Sterling, obviously, his problem has always been that he's got flappy as fuck hands, and despite working with Chris Weidman and Ray Longo, he just can't seem to tighten them up. Decent kicker, but his main thing is like controlling the grappling. I quite like Stamann's chances here, actually. If Sterling can't get him down, I reckon Stamann's got the better hands. Yeah, that's a good fight. I would say I'd like to see Aljamain relying more on the straight kicks and things like that, and then kick into sit-up punches, and then using those punches to get in on takedown attempts. But he could just go out and dive after the leg, because sometimes he does look like a fighter in parts, I suppose. We've got that segmented game where you're like, now I'm wrestling, now I'm striking, now I'm wrestling. And it just doesn't work at the highest levels. Carla Esparza versus Tatiana Suarez. Good on Carla Esparza, because in her last fight against, what's her name? Gedalia, everyone was like, oh, yep, Carla Esparza is getting murdered here. And she did really well. She got a split decision, loss, that is. But yeah, she managed the first round, which is Claudia Gedalia's strong suit, and then did really well in the later rounds. Still wears the worst outfit to the ring of any fighter in the world. Well, not to the ring, in the ring. Reebok managed to make a dad's swimming t-shirt for her somehow. Just let her wear the singlet, for fuck's sake, and then sell singlets to wrestling teams. Could not care about this fight any less. Let's move on. Nico Price versus Abdul Razak Al Hassan. That seems like a mismatch of ranking. No cancellation made that. Nico Price, obviously, people high on him after that fight with Randy Brown, where he knocked him out with a hammer fist from like a knee shield. He tried to push him away and attack the leg. Randy Brown turned back into him, caught a hammer fist across the jaw. Clearly wasn't expecting it and just went out. And never a clearer example of expecting the fact that the ones that you don't see hurt you. Because Randy Brown has taken way harder punches than that on the feet, obviously. Oh yeah, Abdul Razak Al Hassan was booked to fight Muslim Salikov, the Sanshao legend. But that was cancelled, and now he's in against Nico Price. Okay, fun enough fight, like it. Jessica Andrade versus Karolina Kowalkiewicz. My roidy princess against the woman with the oldest face in the world. I like this fight a lot, but I'm really struggling to see Karolina win this. She's got very good knees and stuff from the clinch. I suppose she could work there. Like her best weapon's a long right hand, but she's such a brawler. She's not a very good technical striker, and the brawling is what Andrade wants to get close enough to do. The real difference with Andrade, when she got good, basically, the cut from bantamweight to strawweight helped, but I think she'd be better as a bantamweight now. than she was when she was a bantamweight before, because she added body shots, and once she added the body shots, she really became a force. She used to be just a windmiller, like a small Wanderlei Silva. I remember texting my brother from, God, what was the event that she was murdering poor Rosie Sexton at? That was an event where, being in the crowd, you were like, oh, someone needs to stop this, because it was an English event and nobody was making any noise, and everyone in press row was like, God, they need to stop this fight. And then you watched it on TV afterwards and it was fine. Like, it wasn't as horrific as it seemed at the time. But I remember texting my brother saying, oh my God, this girl's like a small Wanderlei Silva. She added some nice takedowns to that. I mean, the high crotch she was trying against Joanna, like trying to dump her on her head, that was fantastic. And she's got a gas tank. She can keep going. So, where Gedalia is just big and strong and gases, Andrade is slightly smaller, but still Hulk strong, works the body, so she invests over the rounds and can keep going. Like, she just kept walking on Jędrzejczyk's jab the entire time and didn't seem fazed by it. She doesn't have any head movement. She's not very good at dealing with punches. Her response to everything is to parry with the left hand and swing back with the left hook. Doesn't have very good ring craft. Very, very basic as a striker. But, when you're a swarming brawler, you don't act, it's not as important. I mean, you'd be better if you were a good technical striker, but she does her work with her gas tank and her grit more than anything else, and power. It's a tricky one because, where the blueprint to beat someone like Gedalia, who comes forward and tries to swarm you with grappling and stuff, is to jab, move, and try and tire her out, because she gasses so reliably. With someone like Andrade, you've got to jab, move, and keep moving and be able to break out the clinches. And I'm not sure that's the bit, well, the jabbing is also not a bit I think that Karolina can do very well. But staying out of the clinches for the rounds, if she doesn't slow down significantly, is the part that I'm concerned Karolina won't be able to do. But people love Karolina. She is, like, so well regarded, even though I just never see it in her fights. Jodie Esquibel and Felice Herrig were her last two. She got a split decision over Felice Herrig, and people are still ranking her at like number 5 in the world. However, she does have that win over Rose Namajunas back in 2016, which will keep propping her up. Rose's allergy to body shots, especially in the clinch, which really hurt her there. But yeah, that's a good fight. Andrade should be odds-on favourite to win. If Karolina does something amazing, I think it'll take something amazing to win this fight, because it's such a bad stylistic matchup for her. But if she does something amazing, expect me to write about it. Zabit versus Brandon Davis. Brandon Davis 9-5. Let's have a look. Just lost to Enrique Barzola. Lost to Karl Bochniak. Has fought no one else that you know. Okay, cool. Right, that's what we're dealing with here. I mean, I wrote a big article on Zabit this week. Go read it. It's called Zabit Magomed Sharipov, tempering talent with craft. It's just talking about how, like, he's like a young John Jones. When Jones would just sort of flail and spaz and do whatever he wanted and still win fights. And what you really wanted to see him develop into, if he was going to be a truly great fighter in his division, is someone who can take away those opportunities to get back in the fight. Because there are things like when he was fighting Shaman Moraes, he ran in with like a spinning jumping kick that was never going to land, and then he clinched, he got double underhooked, so he tried to whizzer the guy and threw him with the whizzer. The guy came back up, he tried exactly the same throw again, he got taken down into like a leg mount position and mounted. So just by being aggressive, Zabit gave up the mount. And there's all sorts. Every fight he hits the fence almost immediately. He's got terrible ring craft, really bad ring craft. And his thing is, like, guys will push him into the fence, and then he'll try and use the overhooks to turn them, and then try and work from there. And that's the sort of stuff that you can't do when you're fighting someone who's as good as you in the clinch, or even a little bit worse, because you're giving them a better position. With Zabit, I mean, his hands aren't anything special. His kicks are cool, but again, not out of this world. The thing is, like, he's not great at hurting people with strikes. He's not got huge power, but he does land a lot. He's pretty good at picking his spots. He's pretty good at getting people walking onto things. And the other thing is that, like, dudes just swing for his head. Bochniak threw 1 low kick in 150 strikes, and I think like 9 body shots. If you're swinging at the head of a 6 foot whatever heavy featherweight, and their response is to just put their palm in your face, you're not going to hit them. If you get to his body and his legs, you'll have much better success. He gassed in the third round against Bochniak. His takedowns, he went from 5 in 6 to 5 in 11 over the course of the last round. He's very much beatable, but I don't think Brandon Davis is the guy to do it. But if he does those things, he could probably do it. Maybe. Probably, maybe. Nico Montano versus Valentina Shevchenko. This is supposed to be a coronation. I really hope it goes tits up. I watched Nico Montano versus Roxanne Modafferi last night. It was dreadful. She is super scrappy and keeps coming forward. She's not very technically proficient as a striker. She's very scrappy as a wrestler too, just sort of takes top control. But part of that should play into Valentina Shevchenko because she is the counter striker, but also Shevchenko is really bad at pushing her advantage. Which is why she loses all these decisions. She's the female Jorge Masvidal. She looks crisp, doesn't do enough, and then is surprised when the judges don't give her a decision. So who knows? I mean, Valentina's pretty good from the clinch, and Montano does a lot of pressing people towards the fence and then getting the clinch and then trying to take down from there. Valentina famously turned over, who was it? That Venezuelan vixen. What's her name? Really whiny. Kicks people in the balls in bar fights. I can't remember her name, but she swept her from the clinch because the girl tried to knee her, and she swept out the leg in a very Muay Thai sort of style. It'd be interesting to see how she can deal with someone pressing her to the fence and then dropping on their hips, which is not as it's a very common strategy in MMA generally, but you don't really see very good women doing it to Shevchenko. It's more a lot of her fights have been more out of range. It'll be interesting. I mean, actually, it won't. I don't give a shit about this fight, but I would love it if it just went tits up for Shevchenko, because basically Shevchenko's entire career has been people going, yes, she lost, but imagine how good she'd be if she didn't lose. Oh yeah, she lost, but she should be at 125. Oh yeah, she lost, but if the judges had seen it another way and she'd actually done some stuff. Just loads of people making excuses for her because she's kind of cute. And then Tyron Woodley versus Darren Till. I think with Till, you've got to focus on the low-line sidekicks and things like that. His best stuff is 1-2s and bouncing back on counters from his opponent being on the fence. Tyron Woodley tends to spend a lot of time on the fence, but Tyron Woodley can come forward. Against Robbie Lawler, he came forward a lot more and was more aggressive, threatening the shot to set up the overhand. And that could be the case against Till because he's not really concerned about Till taking him down, I imagine. I'll be writing a big piece for Unibet on this one, but you can get, 50-1 odds on a draw? I put £1 on a draw just because I could totally see both of these guys doing nothing, it going to decision, and then somehow there being a draw. Or one of them getting penalised for grabbing the fence at some point and it somehow being a draw. I think Darren Till's length is a very interesting factor. Wonderboy, obviously quite a gangly dude, but fights from a very low stance. I'd be interested if Till can get to his body. Till doesn't really go to the body all that much. Whereas, I still think Rory McDonald's performance is the perfect performance to beat Woodley even now. You get him to the fence, you throw in a long kick or something to his body, he comes back on you, you stuff it with underhooks and sling him off from the clinch, or you intercept him with an elbow, or you roll off the right hand and counter. He's a very limited fighter in terms of what he does. I'm not saying he's not good. Obviously he's good. He's the best in the world. But the things that he goes to, there aren't that many of them, which kind of makes him boring to watch for me. And it has for a very long time. Even back before he got his title shot, I was I don't really want to have to write another article about him. According to Tyrone, that would make me racist. But, he seems like a cool, down-to-earth guy. I just don't enjoy watching him fight. Mind you, Till's last fight was such a snoozer too. Oh. Anyway, we'll see how that does on the old buy rate afterwards. Let's do a couple of questions and then we'll get out of here for this week. Hey Jack, I have been recently introduced to your many articles and podcasts. I can say that I love your work. I love the work you do on martial arts, from various combat sports to the history in general and the unique fighting styles that you've been presented. My question is, will we have an article about Rizin 13's main event, Tenshin versus Koji, in a kickboxing match? Thank you from Hong. Yeah, I didn't mention it when it got signed. I must have forgotten, but that is a very interesting fight. I'm not going to say it's a good fight because you're still giving Tenshin a guy who doesn't kickbox in a kickboxing match, which is all that Rizin seems to do. However, they do have Tenshin's fighting Tiger on New Year's Eve, I believe, which should give us a nice measuring stick between him and Takeru. But yeah, I mean, it's a good challenge for Koji. I think if he loses, he probably won't get hurt that bad. It's kind of like when they used to get MMA fighters to fight Masato. It was the only time Masato would ever get a finish, but obviously Tenshin finishes much better guys than MMA fighters, but it's sort of like a gimmicky thing, and also people have been calling for it, because firstly, a lot of fans don't understand the difference. That's part of it. As you could see from the reaction when this was signed, my reaction was like, oh, well, it could be worse. It keeps Kyoji busy, and, it'll allow him some time to work specifically on one area of his game. It's like we said about Connor. Like, who in the MMA gets a year off to just work on their boxing and then test it against the best boxer in the world, or one of? So in that sense, it keeps Kyoji busy because they don't really have many fighters for him. He just beat Ogikubo, whatever his name is, again. And it gets eyes on Tenshin, I'm just glad they're not just setting up these poor guys who just shouldn't be in the ring with him. At least with Kyoji, you can say, okay, well, he's the very best bantamweight, outside, featherweight, whatever, flyweight. Fuck. He's the very best guy outside the UFC that isn't Gegard Mousasi or Rory McDonald. Scratch that. He's the best guy outside the UFC who isn't Rory McDonald. Gotta trigger the Mousasi fans. But he should lose, but at least he's not that guy who's just shooting takedowns desperately because he's never had a kickboxing match. Even in the Rizin kickboxing tournament, they had dudes who were making their professional debut or had like 0.5 records. Rizin have been really fucking lazy with the kickboxing stuff. They'll have kickboxing fights on any card, but they'll have Tenshin fight some scrub for no reason aside from to get a knockout on TV or on whatever they are projecting on in Japan. At least in this fight, you have Kyoji, who is a tough dude who's got some striking chops. The thing, I will be writing about it extensively, but the thing that sort of sucks for Kyoji in this fight is that the guys who've done well against Tenshin have been Swakim and Rodtang, 2 ties. And they did that in, what's it called? No Kick, No Life. I think it's just called Knockout. But you can watch their fights on YouTube, and they did well by pushing him back, pressuring him. And it was 2 different types of pressure. Swakim was a very tentative, sort of needling you with the teep, pushing you back, and then he'd step in on the ropes. And then Rodtang was just taking Tenshin's best shots, like gurning at him and then walking forward swinging. So 2 very different types of guy, but by pressing him to the ropes, Tenshin's ringcraft ain't great. He does a runner, and then he has to like sprint around the ring to get into a new position, and he gets really tired. Both those fights, 4th and 5th round, he was bollocksed. So, I think that's the style of fight that Tenshin's going to have trouble with, but that's also the sort of fight that I wouldn't want to see Kyoji doing in this fight. I think that's giving Tenshin more opportunities to counter, especially for Kyoji, who's a very, his stance is very much made for a long-range engagement. It's very long, very not wide, very long, and very sort of side-on, and it's not very like shelled up like a more Thai style. If you watch Sarkin fight, he's very cautious. Nothing's coming in, nothing's sneaking through. Obviously stuff does, but he's very cautious of everything at all times, whereas Kyoji is much better at using distance as his main sort of defense. It's 2 very different styles. Kyoji's always done better drawing people on and countering the step, which is also what Tenshin does, and I suspect Tenshin's better at it because he does it against world-class kickboxers and Nakmuay. I think if Kyoji stays to his normal style and cautious and stays out in the open and bursts in occasionally, and firstly bursting in against Tenshin very dangerous because he's waiting to drop the hammer. That's what he wants. So gotta feint well, gotta use long kicks and things to keep him off guard. But I think fighting more conservatively will make a more boring fight, but I think it makes a better chance of Kyoji going to the decision. I think he gets hurt if he tries to overwhelm Tenshin or pressure him without the solid background in pressuring people. So I'm really interested in that fight. I just think that people, I don't know, maybe everyone's interested in it for the same reason as me, just in a kind of way. It's people who are who think that's the logical fight to make. It's just strange to me. Anyway, thanks, Hong. We'll talk more about that at a later date, and I'll do a big piece on it, I imagine, because I quite like to advertise everything Kyoji does, because he's a cool guy, and he's also very, very talented, and he's exactly the sort of person that the UFC should be marketing, especially in Japan. But they fucked that up, so, it's down to me now. Oh, cheers, Hong. Hey Jack, love the podcast. Have a few questions and topics I'd like your thoughts on. I'm pretty familiar with MMA, but much less boxing. Do you think you could recommend some classic boxing fights to get someone like myself familiarized with the sport? Related to this question, do you think boxing is more or less dead now? Other than a few exceptions like Canelo versus Triple G, is boxing still a sport worth watching? Now a question about MMA. I was reflecting on some of BJJ Scout's videos on Khabib, specifically the ones where he breaks down how Sambo fills in certain gaps that wrestling has, most notably the absence of any striking. Would you predict Sambo will overtake wrestling and become a sort of must-have base for MMA fighters in the future? Thanks from Tommy. Right, first question. Boxing, nah, it's not dead. It's the same as MMA. It's, we're looking at boxing from the standpoint that boxing fans look at MMA, or outside people look at MMA, where, not a lot going on in MMA. Oh, Connor's fighting, brilliant. So, I don't think anyone outside of MMA, outside of like the MMA fan base, is going Till versus Woodley. Oh, yes, please. I think there's always going to be stuff going on in boxing. The thing for me, the reason that I don't follow boxing as closely as I used to is because there's so much MMA on, and I prefer it. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that. I don't have anything against people saying they prefer boxing or kickboxing. It's the same reason I can't keep up with all the kickboxing, because there's a fuck ton of MMA on, and I write about it for a job. I still keep up with the big fights in boxing. I try and keep up with things like what Bud Crawford's doing, Triple G, Canelo, all that shit. And I try and keep an eye on Inoue and people like that. I think it helps that there's an awful lot of bollocks in boxing. One of the things that really puts me off boxing is that I have to watch guys fight loads of people who they shouldn't before they fight someone that they should. Whereas in the UFC, I can watch someone come into the UFC having, earned their way up on the outside. And then if they're in the UFC, I know they're fairly good. And I know that the person that they're fighting is probably fairly good. Not always the case, obviously, but I think that there's a lot less record padding in MMA, generally, unless Scott Coker gets his way in future. But that's just a culture thing. I'm sure if you are well into boxing, you know exactly what to tune out. Good fights for the outsider. I would say any of the possible permutations, whatever it is, between the four kings. So Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvin Hagler, Tommy Hearns, Roberto Duran. I don't think they had a bad fight between them, except Leonard versus Duran 2 and 3. Most people don't even know there was a 3. Probably not as worth watching, but those four guys, when they were the period when they were fighting each other, that's tremendous. Any of that. I mean, start with Duran versus Leonard, because that's fantastic. In fact, start with like Legendary Nights documentary on one of those fights, because I think they did most of them. They're terrific, and it's not heavyweight stuff, so it's going to be fast, and they're all decent hitters. I say they're all decent. The least hitting of all of them is a decent hitter, and the best hitting is Tommy Hearns. So. It's never a boring moment, and especially if you don't know the results going in. Otherwise, you could watch the career of someone like Tyson, but again, that's got a lot of padding in there. I would say the golden era of heavyweight, sort of like around the time that Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, George Foreman. I mean, Muhammad Ali sort of straddled several eras, but all through his career, there's some good heavyweights around. Guys like Ken Norton, Quarry, George Chuvalo, even Buster Mathis, who was a big 300-pounder, had super fast hands, got into the Olympics, dropped out, I think, and then Joe Frazier took his place and won the medal. I think that's how that happened, can't remember. But basically, he teamed up with Custamato. Custamato got him down to like a normal fighting weight, but tried to change him and just completely ruined his style. But he was a fascinating character. So that golden era of heavyweights, all great. Start with, if you don't have any interest in boxing pre-existing, start with the documentaries. Things like When We Were Kings is one of my favourite films of all time. That's about the Rumble in the Jungle. And the Rumble in the Jungle is fucking fascinating from every standpoint. Even I make my wife watch it fairly regularly because I love watching it. But the whole music festival, Don King, all that shit going on, and they sort of marketed it as a civil rights thing. We're going back to Africa. Don King put up posters saying, "From the slave ship to the championship." How bad is that? It's just fucking Don King being Don King. So yeah, I start with that. Start with the documentaries. And of course, the first Canelo versus Triple G fight was pretty good too, so you could always watch that to catch you up. That was a bit of a shocker. I mean, I'll be writing about this next week, I imagine, but it was a bit of a shocker because people like Golovkin's the bigger banger, and then Canelo was supposed to be the more scientific boxer, and then Canelo came out clueless as Triple G just stuffed this jab down his throat. And Triple G didn't really do much power punching in that fight at all. He had this very weird, like, don't see it often, super high elbows and forearms guard, like Mendoza style. Or Manny Pacquiao used to do it when he was, like, getting more confident taking body shots. He'd put his elbows way up in front of his head, like I think someone called it a triangle guard. But, yeah, Triple G was doing that. It was super weird, but a good fight nonetheless. Anyway, questions about Sambo. I don't know enough about Sambo, to be honest. I thought that Sambo and Combat Sambo were different things. Combat Sambo is the one with including striking. Sambo, people used to just, well, back in the day, before it became super trendy, people just used to call it like the Russian judo. And Russian judo in itself is a thing. Like they had a big sort of, they put in lots of interesting developments in the Olympics, which subsequently people banned because they didn't want it. Like they used to, I don't know, actually, I imagine some of this stuff's still legal, but they used to like leg grabs and suplexes and things. The suplex, they'd be like, it's actually an uranagi, mate. And the IJF hated it. They were like, no, it's a suplex. They used to do some interesting leg grabs. They had great entries on arm bars. They used to love, the Russian team used to be the USSR team, so we're talking a huge territory. But the Georgian grip is a very famous over the belt grip. Cabarelli used to use the I think it was Georgian grip to do his famous Cabarelli throw, which is like a weird thing where you wheel them over by the belt, which is awesome. Look that up, Cabarelli throw. I think it's KHAB Relly. So yeah, for a very long time, people were like, "That's Sambo. It's Russian judo, but with leg locks." And then there's this thing where we have to like everything has to be different. It can't just be that Luta Livre was grappling and BJJ was grappling, and one did it in the gi and one didn't do it in the gi. It has to be like, well, Luta Livre guys tend to do this and blah blah blah, and that's a style of Luta. And you're like, no, because back in the day when if you're talking about like a traditional martial art, you are given your base as a style. If you're talking BJJ, I could be rolling BJJ and playing Spider Guard the entire time. I could be rolling BJJ and coming up on a single every single time. One of those makes me look like a wrestler, and one of those makes me look like, a wannabe Meow. If you're sparring fairly regularly, your own style develops, and it has nothing to do, well, not nothing to do with, but it's, that doesn't tell you anything about the overall style or, the name on the dojo that you're walking into. So I think people get this big boner over Sambo, and it's the same as people being like catch wrestling, and you're like, catch wrestling, not really a thing. It's just grappling now. It's just a bunch of guys who meet up and say, I wish pins were counted, but I'm going to work on double wrist locks. To a degree, things are influenced by the competition rules, but now that we're all sort of fighting under the same rules, and particularly when you come to MMA, it's just grappling. It's interesting to see when things that have been developed by the rule set that you then apply once the rule set's taken away, which maybe wouldn't have existed otherwise. For instance, like the Horiguchi karate style, or Machida or something like that. If everyone had just been going at it MMA style from the beginning, maybe we'd still be in a position where everyone was in that sort of like sprawl shorts, overhands and leg kicks, and I call myself a Muay Thai fighter. But by taking that weird point fighting system where you tried not to get touched, and bringing it over to MMA, suddenly it made sense. Whereas if you took that to a kickboxing ring, which Koji Horiguchi is about to do, that's probably not going to work. Or certainly isn't favoured by the rules there. But as I was saying, like, people used to be... The whole thing was like, nobody knew anything about Sambo, but you'd go, Sambo guys, they're really good at the leg locks because they allowed leg locks and judo didn't. Whereas now, like, there are better grapplers, there are better leg lockers who just have never done a day of Sambo in their life because they worked on leg locks for a very long time. No martial art is going to give you magic background in anything. You could be a Nakmoy and be very good at making distance and cracking people with counterpunches like that karate style. I don't know how much historical. I just don't know how much it matters in the modern day when people like Habib are training with BJJ guys every day, BJJ black belts every day. I just it's just grappling, mate. Grappling, and the person that's doing it is putting a different emphasis on what they're doing. But I'll have to watch Scout's videos now because I haven't actually seen the Habib ones. Anyway, cheers, Tommy. Right, we'd run up to the hour. Feature-length podcast today. So I reckon we'll call it a day there. If you want to get on the Patreon, there's going to be actually 2 episodes coming now because it was getting too long. And you know how like when you're doing something and then I was interested by what I was doing. So I saw this book called All the Tea in China. I was like, oh, that's weird. I've just been polishing off my podcast on that. And then I started reading it. And I was like, oh, fuck, this is all going to have to go in the podcast. So we'll have 2 episodes coming out this week, history episode-wise, to make up for the slow coming out of the first one. And then after those Opium War episodes are out of the way, I'm going to go and do Muhammad Ali versus Sonny Liston. We're going to be doing the first of several Muhammad Ali episodes. So if you want to get in on that, or just support the podcast, sign up to the Patreon. If you want to send an email or a question or a complaint, or actually I've got some interesting lists of fighters who were very good but never won titles in the UFC. People sent me that this week, and I will read them out at some point next week. Send it to fightsgonepodcast@gmail.com. If you want to see what I'm up to at any time, fightprimer.com. I've got various stuff going up on Vice and Unibet this week. And the new edition of Notorious, I am told, is out. So get on that. I'm your boy Jack Slack, and I'll see you on Monday, and we hopefully will have a bloody good laugh if Nico Montano wins. More likely, it's going to be a coronation, but can you imagine the salt, the excuses? Well, I always thought that Valentina was more suited to a 120 class. Anyway, I'll catch you next week. Cheers.